The plasma burns across Corporal Kim. Taeho's shoulder still smoldered as he dragged himself behind the twisted wreckage of what had once been the colony's medical center. New Seoul was dying around him, its prefabricated buildings reduced to slag and ash under the relentless bombardment of the Valith. Fleet Tato's fingers trembled as he activated his emergency beacon, the small device flickering to life with a weak blue glow. Around him, the screams had finally stopped. The silence was worse than the chaos that had preceded it. The young soldier remembered how the day had started. He had been cleaning his rifle in the barracks when the sirens began. At first, everyone thought it was another drill. The colony of New Seoul was far from the war zones, hidden in a quiet corner of space where families came to build new lives. Then the sky had turned red. The Valith ships appeared without warning, their massive forms blocking out the sun. They looked like floating mountains made of black metal and purple light. The colonists had maybe 10 minutes before the first bombs fell. Taeho had run to his post at the communication center while buildings exploded around him. He watched through his scope as the alien soldiers dropped from the sky like deadly rain. They were huge, almost 3 meters tall, with skin that looked like broken glass. Their weapons made no sound when they fired, but everything they touched simply disappeared. "This is Corporal Kim Taeho, 4th Colonial Defense Battalion," he whispered into the recorder, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "The colony of New Seoul has fallen. Population was 12,437 souls. Military casualties, total." He had tried to count the dead, but there were too many. Mrs. Han from the bakery, who always gave him extra bread, the Kim family, with their 3 young children. Old Mr. Park, who told stories about Earth. All gone in less than 6 hours. The defense had been hopeless from the start. The colonists had hunting rifles and farming tools. The Valith had weapons that could cut through buildings like paper. But they had fought anyway. They had fought because it was their home. Private Lee Dong-sik had been just 18 years old. He had held the eastern checkpoint alone for 3 hours, giving families time to escape into the mountains. Taeho had seen him fall through his binoculars, still firing even as the alien soldiers surrounded him. Sergeant Park Ji-woo had been a teacher before joining the Defense Force. She had run into the burning children's shelter 3 times, carrying out kids who were too scared to move. On her 4th trip, the building collapsed. She never came out. They came without warning. No demands, no negotiation, just ... extermination. Ho's voice cracked. But we fought. Damn it, we fought. Private Lee Dong-sik held the eastern checkpoint alone for 3 hours. Sergeant Park Ji-woo evacuated the children's shelter under direct fire. We are not the primitives they believe us to be. Through the smoke, Taeho could see the Valith soldiers moving through the ruins. They walked slowly, carefully, checking every corner. They did not speak to each other. They did not seem angry or excited. They killed like machines without emotion or hesitation. But Taeho had seen something else. The aliens thought no. One was watching. Some of them hesitated. One had stopped for a long moment over the body of a child. Another had turned away when ordered to burn the hospital. Maybe they were not all monsters. Maybe some of them had hearts. The beacon's power. Indicator blinked red. Almost out of time, Tae-ho thought about his sister back on Earth. She was studying to be a doctor. She wanted to help people, to make the galaxy a better place. He thought about his parents, who had saved money for years to send him to the colony. They believed in the dream of humans spreading across the stars. The Valith thought humans were weak. They thought humans were nothing but animals who had learned to use tools. They were wrong. I need the galaxy to know humans don't surrender. We don't bow, and we remember our fallen. Heavy footsteps approached. Taeho could hear the soft hum of alien technology getting closer. He closed his eyes and thought about everyone who had died today. They had died protecting something beautiful. They had died believing in tomorrow. The beacon was almost dead, but it still had enough power to send one last message into space. Maybe someone would hear it. Maybe someone would understand. Taeho pressed the transmission button and whispered his final words into the void. He told the darkness about courage and sacrifice. He told the stars about people who chose to fight. Impossible battles because fighting was better than surrender. The footsteps stopped right behind him. Tejo opened his eyes and saw his own reflection in the alien's crystalline face. The message was already traveling through space, carrying the story of new soul to anyone who would listen. He had been one soldier in a forgotten battle, but his voice would echo across the galaxy long after the fires had died. 3 months later, on the monitoring station orbiting Valeth Prime, Junior Analyst Keithama nearly deleted the signal automatically, another piece of debris data from the conquered rim worlds. But something in the biosignature readings made her pause. Cthulhu had been working the night shift for 2 years. Her job was simple but boring. She listened to radio signals from space and sorted them into files. Most were just noise from dead stars or broken satellites. Sometimes she found military reports or supply lists from conquered worlds. Nothing exciting ever happened. The monitoring station was a small metal circle floating in space around the Valeth home planet. Through her window, she could see the purple and blue swirls of her world's atmosphere. It looked peaceful from up here, beautiful even, but Keithuma knew better. Down there, the War Council was planning the next invasion. Always another world to conquer, always another species to control. She almost pressed the delete button on the new signal. It looked like all the others, weak, distant, probably just space junk. But something made her stop. The pattern was different. It had a rhythm, like a heartbeat. The transmission was unlike anything in the Imperial archives. Not the usual surrender declarations or resource manifests. Something ... personal. Raw. As she ran it through the translation matrix, Cthulhu found herself leaning closer to her workstation. The translation computer worked slowly. First came numbers and coordinates. Then words started appearing on her screen. The language was human, from one of the outer colonies. Kethema had studied human languages in school, but she had never heard one spoken before. A voice emerged from the static. Desperate, defiant, achingly human. We are not the primitives they believe us to be. Cthuma's secondary hearts began racing. She had 2 hearts, like all her people. The main one pumped blood through her body. The smaller one helped during times of stress or excitement. Right. Now, both were beating fast. The voice continued. It told a story of a place called New Soul and people who had died fighting. The human soldier spoke about his friends by name. He talked about a teacher who had saved children and a young man who had fought alone against impossible odds. In all her cycles of monitoring conquered species, she had never heard such emotion, such unwavering determination in the face of certain death. The humans spoke of sacrifice, of protecting the weak, of dying for ideals rather than merely survival. Cthulhu had been taught that humans were animals, smart animals, but animals nonetheless. They fought only for food and territory, like all primitive species. They had no honor, no real culture, no deep thoughts. But this voice was different. This human talked about protecting others even when he knew he would die. He talked about remembering the fallen and fighting for something bigger than himself. These were not the words of an animal. The message was short, maybe 5 minutes long. But Cthulhu listened to it 3 times before she understood what she was hearing. This was not a military report or a cry for help. This was a testament, final statement from someone who knew he was about to die. She should have filed it with the Military Intelligence Division. That was the rule. All human communications had to be studied by the war planners. They used the information to find weaknesses and plan better attacks. Instead, she copied the transmission to her personal storage and began to listen again. And again, each time she heard it, she noticed something new. The way the human's voice shook when he talked about the children. The pride in his words when he described his friend's bravery. The quiet anger when he spoke about the attack. Cthulhu had never heard a Valeth soldier talk like this. When her people died in battle, they died for the Empire. For duty, for conquest. But this human had died for love. For protecting the innocent. For an idea that life was precious, the night shift was almost over. In an hour, the day workers would arrive and Keithuma would go home to her small apartment. She would eat breakfast and sleep until evening. Then she would come back and listen. 2 more signals from space, but tonight was different. Tonight she had heard something that changed everything. That evening, she shared it with her clutchmate Vextari, who worked in the communication networks. Vextari was like a sister to her. They had grown up together, gone to school together, joined the Imperial service together. "Listen to this," she whispered. Just ... listen. They met in Kethuma's apartment after work. The place was small but clean, with a view of the city lights below. Kethuma made tea and they sat by the window. "What is it?" Vextari asked. "Just listen," Kethuma said again. She played the transmission at first. Vextari looked bored. Another work project, another duty. But as the human's voice filled the room, her expression changed. Her eyes grew wide, her hands stopped moving. When the message ended, they sat in silence for a long time. "Play it again," Vextari whispered. They listened to Kim Taeho's final words 5 times that night. Each time, it hit them harder. This was not the voice of a primitive animal. This was the voice of someone who understood what it meant to be truly alive. By morning, everything had changed. The transmission had planted a seed in their minds. Soon, that seed would grow into something the Empire had never faced before. The voice of one dying human had reached across the darkness and touched the hearts of his enemies. The transmission of Kim Tae-ho spread through the galactic networks like spores on solar winds. Within weeks, it had reached every major world, translated into hundreds of languages, shared in underground forums and resistant cells. Vextari had been the first to share it. She worked in the communication networks, so she knew how to send messages across the galaxy without being traced. Late one night, she uploaded the recording to a small forum where young Valeth talked about art and music. "Found this in the archives," she wrote. "Thought you might find it interesting." By morning, 50 people had downloaded it. By the end of the week, it was on every major world in the galaxy, on Kepler 186f. A mining world where the native Thorians worked in deep caves, the message arrived in a data packet hidden inside a supply manifest. The Thorians were small, furry, creatures with large eyes, adapted for seeing in the dark. They had been enslaved for 30 years, forced to dig rare metals for the Valeth Empire. When their leader, an old Thorian named Kek, heard Taeho's words, he translated them into his own language. That night, in the deepest tunnels where the guards never went, he played the recording for his people. "Listen," he whispered. "This human speaks for all of us." The enslaved Thorian miners heard Taeho's words and saw their own struggle reflected. In his defiance, they had been told they were nothing. They had been told they existed only to serve. But this human had died believing that all life was precious. The next day, production in the mines slowed down. The Thorians worked slower, took longer breaks, made small mistakes. The guards punished them, but they did not stop. They had heard something that gave them hope. On Proxima Centauri b, in the work camps where prisoners from a dozen different species labored under the hot sun, the message arrived in a different form. A young musician named Zara had turned Taeho's words into a song. The camps were harsh places where hope died quickly. Prisoners worked 16 hours a day building weapons for the Valeth military. Many never lived to see their families again. But when Zara's song spread through the barracks, something changed. The Zephyrian work camps on Proxima Centauri b began quietly humming the melody that had been composed around his final transmission. First, just a few voices in the darkness, then more. Soon, entire work groups were humming together as they carried heavy stones and mixed concrete. The guards tried to stop them, but how do you stop a song? How do you arrest a melody? The humming spread from camp to camp, carried by transferred prisoners and new arrivals. In a month, every slave on the planet knew the tune. But it was on Valeth Prime itself where the message struck deepest. The home world of the Empire was a place of great cities and beautiful gardens. Most citizens lived comfortable lives, far from the violence of conquest. They supported the military because they were told it protected them from dangerous aliens. Young Valeth, like Kithuma and Vextari, began questioning the Empire's doctrine of superiority. They started meeting in secret, in small groups of 5 or 6. They would gather in someone's apartment or in quiet corners of the university library. They organized secret gatherings where they would play the transmission and discuss what it meant. The meetings were always small and always careful. The Imperial Police watched for signs of rebellion. "How can we call them primitive when they die for others?" Bextari asked during one such meeting. "When did we last see such honor among our own kind?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew the answer. Valeth soldiers died for the Empire, for glory, for conquest. But when had one died simply to protect innocent people? A young student named Coulter spoke up. "My brother is in the military. He says the humans fight differently than other species. They don't just fight for territory, they fight for ideas." "What kind of ideas?" someone asked. "That all life has value, that the strong should protect the weak. That dying for others is the highest honor." The meetings grew larger. Word spread through the universities, through the art districts, through the working-class neighborhoods. Young Valeth began to ask questions their parents had never asked. The Valeth High Command tried to suppress the recording. Too late. General Vorthak ordered all copies deleted from the networks. The Imperial Police raided homes and arrested anyone found with the transmission, but every attempt to silence it only amplified its reach. When the police arrested 10 people for sharing the recording, 100 more downloaded it in protest. When they blocked access to the forums, new ones appeared overnight. The story of one human soldier had become a mirror, reflecting the moral decay of an entire civilization. The Empire had built its power on the idea that might made right, that superior technology justified any action, that conquered peoples were naturally inferior. But Tejo's message challenged all of that. Here was a member of a primitive species showing more honor than the Empire's greatest warriors. Here was someone willing to die for strangers, while the Empire killed strangers for profit. The transmission had planted seeds of doubt in a million minds. Soon those seeds would grow into something the Empire had never faced before, a revolution. Of conscience, one soldier's final words were about to topple a civilization. The revolution began not with weapons, but with conscience. On a cold morning in the capital city of Valeth Prime, Cthulhu stood before a crowd of 200 young people gathered in an abandoned warehouse. 6 months ago, she had been a quiet worker listening to radio signals in space. She was leading a movement that would change the galaxy. "We have been told we are the superior race," she said to the crowd. "We have been told that conquest is our right. But listen to these words again." She played Kim Taeho's transmission. The warehouse fell silent as the human soldier's voice filled the space. His words about sacrifice and protecting the innocent echoed off the metal walls. One soldier's testimony has done what 1,000 fleets could not. Cthulhu declared to the growing crowds in the capital's underground chambers. "It has shown us what we have become. Across the galaxy, species that had been conquered or subjugated began to see Kim Taeho's sacrifice as a symbol of resistance. On the mining world of Kepler 186f, the Thorians carved his words into the tunnel walls. On the prison planet of Wolf 359, inmates from a dozen different species learned to say we remember our fallen in each other's languages. His words, remember our fallen, became a rallying cry for the oppressed. The phrase appeared on walls, in hidden messages, in the songs that prisoners sang. It became a code that let people know they were not alone in their hope for freedom. Memorial services were held in secret, honoring not just the human dead, but all those who had fallen under Valeth rule. In the deep caves of Kepler 186f, Thorian miners lit candles for their dead. On the work camps of Proxima Centauri b, prisoners placed flowers on unmarked graves. On Valeth Prime itself, young people gathered in hidden places to honor those who had died fighting for others. These were not just memorials for the dead. They were declarations that some things were more important than survival, that love was stronger than fear, that the powerful could not destroy the human spirit, no matter how hard they tried. On Valeth Prime, the schism deepened. The older generation watched the growing protests with anger and fear. Their comfortable world was being challenged by their own children. The older generation, led by War Commander Zextel, dismissed the growing dissent as alien contamination. He was a veteran of 50 campaigns, a warrior who had conquered dozens of worlds. To him, the empire was perfect, and the protests were a disease. These young fools have been poisoned by alien ideas, he told the High Council. They listen to the words of primitives and think they have found wisdom. We must crush this rebellion before it spreads further, but it was already too late. The contamination had spread too far to stop. Younger Valith like Kithuma had organized into a movement they called the Truth Seekers. They wore simple white bands on their arms and met in secret locations across the planet. Their numbers grew every day. The Truth Seekers did not carry weapons. They did not attack government buildings or military bases. Instead, they asked questions, shared Kim Tae-ho's recording. They forced people to think about what the Empire had become. We are not asking you to rebel, Cthulhu told new members. We are asking you to listen, to think, to remember what it means to have a conscience. The movement spread beyond Valith. Prime, on military bases across the galaxy, young Valith soldiers began refusing orders. When commanded to attack civilian targets, they laid down their weapons. When ordered to execute prisoners, they walked away. The Empire's iron grip began to weaken as entire sectors declared autonomy. The governor of the Centauri system announced that his worlds would no longer follow imperial military commands. Mining colonies of the Outer Rim formed their own defense pacts. The Free Worlds Coalition formed, Rifteo's final transmission serving as their founding document. Representatives from dozens of species met on the neutral world of Sanctuary. To sign a new charter? They agreed that all intelligent life had value, that the strong should protect the weak, and that conquest was not a right but a crime, even within the Valith military. Officers began refusing orders to attack civilian populations. Captain Morden, a decorated veteran, was court-martialed for refusing to bomb a hospital. Commander Yetho resigned rather than lead an attack on a school. I joined the military to protect our people, Captain Morden said at his trial. I will not become a monster to serve the Empire. War Commander Zexthal tried to maintain order through force. He arrested thousands of protesters, banned public gatherings, and declared martial law. But for every person he arrested, 10 more joined the movement. The story of one human's courage had awakened something the Empire had tried to destroy. Across the galaxy, the idea that some things were worth dying for. Not for conquest or glory, but for love. It's for protecting the innocent. For the belief that all life was precious. In the end, the Empire's greatest weapon became its greatest weakness. They had taught the galaxy to fear death. Kim Tae-ho had taught them something more powerful, that there were things more important than staying alive. The revolution had begun with one soldier's final words. Now those words were echoing across 1,000 worlds, carried by millions of voices who had rediscovered their conscience. The Empire was falling, not to superior weapons, but to superior ideas. The Valith Empire collapsed not in a single battle, but in the quiet moments when soldiers laid down their weapons and chose conscience over conquest. It happened slowly, then all at once. The morning of the 15th day of the 7th month, General Vorthak stood before his command staff and announced that the military would no longer follow orders from the High Council. Half of his officers agreed. The other half walked out of the room. By noon, 3 entire fleets had declared their independence. From Imperial Command, by evening, the capital city was surrounded by soldiers who refused to fire on civilians. By midnight, the last members of the High Council were in prison, charged with crimes against the galaxy. The revolution had taken 3 years to build and 3 days to complete. No great battles were fought. No cities were burned. The Empire simply stopped existing when enough people decided they would no longer serve it. 5 years later, Cthulhu stood before a very different crowd. She was older now, her crystalline skin marked with the stress lines that came from leading a government through difficult times. But her eyes still held the same fire that had driven her to share a human soldier's message with the galaxy Twotes. Uma, now leading the reformed Valith government, stood before the memorial erected on the rebuilt world of New Sol. The crystalline monument stretched toward the sky, inscribed with Kim Tae-ho's words in every known language. The memorial was beautiful in its simplicity. single crystal spire. Reaching toward the stars, surrounded by gardens where flowers from 100 different worlds grew together, at its base, carved in stone, were the words that had changed everything. We are not just surviving, we are remembering. Around the memorial, the city of New Sol had been rebuilt. It's not as it was before, but as something better. Humans, Valeth. Thorians and members of dozens of other species lived and worked together. Children played in parks that had once been battlefields. Markets sold goods from across the galaxy in streets that had once run with blood. The crowd that gathered for the memorial ceremony was unlike anything the old empire would have allowed. Humans stood next to their former conquerors. Former slaves shared food with former masters. Species that had been enemies for centuries now worked together to build something new. He could not have known, she said to the gathered crowd of humans, Valeth and dozens of other species, that his final act of defiance would topple a civilization. But perhaps that was always the power of truth. It needs no armies, only voices willing to speak it. The crowd listened in respectful silence. Many had lost family members in the wars. Others had been soldiers themselves on both sides of the conflict. But they had all come together to honor the memory of a man who had shown them a different way to live. In the crowd, elderly human with familiar eyes watched quietly. His hair was white now, his face lined with age and experience. He wore simple clothes and stood apart from the dignitaries and officials. Most people walked past him without a second glance. Kim Tae-ho had survived his capture, had lived to see the fall of the empire and the rise of something better. The Valeth soldiers who had found him that day had been young and scared. Of killing him, they had taken him prisoner. He had spent 2 years in a military camp, then 3 more years in a work prison. By the time he was released, the galaxy had changed. The empire was gone. His message had traveled farther than he had ever imagined. But he had chosen to remain anonymous, understanding that the power of his story lay not in his identity, but in its universal truth. He had been offered medals, honors, positions in the new government. Reporters wanted to interview him. Historians wanted to write his biography, but he had refused them all. The man who had become a symbol of resistance preferred to remain in the shadows. Tae-ho worked now as a teacher in a small school on the outskirts of the city. He taught children of all species about history and literature. His students called him Mr. Kim. They knew he had been a soldier once, but they did not know he was the soldier whose words had changed the galaxy. He liked it that way. The message was more important than the messenger. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Tae-ho placed a single flower at the base of the memorial. It was a simple white flower, the kind that grew wild in the fields around New Sol. Nothing special or expensive, just a small gesture of remembrance. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the friends he had lost and the world they had helped to build. Privately, Dong-sik, who had held his post alone for 3 hours. Sergeant Park Ji-woo, who had died saving children. All the others whose names were carved into the memorial's base. He had been one soldier. But his story had reminded the galaxy of something precious, that courage, sacrifice, the willingness to stand for others were not primitive traits, but the highest expressions of civilization itself. The inscription caught the light of the setting sun. We are not just surviving, we are remembering. As the sun set over New Sol, Kim Tae-ho walked quietly home through streets filled with the children of a dozen different species, all playing together in the golden light. His message had traveled across the galaxy and back again. Now it lived. In the simple act of former enemies choosing to be friends, the story was complete. The galaxy had remembered how to hope.